Tonight, I'm going to my ex's house to comfort her. Don't make a scene. Melissa, he said it while adjusting his tie in the mirror, his voice as casual as if he were checking the weather. There was no guilt in his eyes, only a cold, arrogant assumption that I would be the stable one, that I would swallow my pride, keep the house warm, and wait for him to finish playing hero in another woman's bed. In that heartbeat, the man I was supposed to marry became a stranger. But I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I simply nodded. Ethan thought he was leaving a nagging wife behind for the night. What he didn't realize was that he was walking out on the CEO of his entire life. While he was comforting her, I was performing a silent surgical audit of every cent, every password, and every legal tie that bound us together. By the time his car left the driveway, the man I once loved was already a ghost in his own home. You are about to hear the story of a woman who stopped being a victim and started being a system. From the secret document I made him sign a year ago to the moment his mother realized their golden ticket had just been revoked, this isn't just a breakup. It is a total systematic erasure. Stay with me until the very end, because the look on his face when he returns to a house that no longer knows his name is a payoff you have to see to believe. This is why you never tell a woman like me not to make a scene, because when we finally go quiet, it's because we're busy ending your world. My name is Melissa. At 38 years old, I have spent over a decade mastering the art of the smooth run as a senior operations manager, a career that requires me to anticipate disasters before they happen and keep complex systems functioning in total silence. I am the woman people rely on when they want their world to make sense, a trait that followed me home and unfortunately became the very foundation upon which my fiancé Ethan built his effortless existence. The evening began with the kind of practiced domesticity that usually feels like comfort, but in hindsight was merely the silence before a structural collapse. I was in the kitchen of the suburban home I bought 3 years ago, moving with a rhythmic efficiency that had become second nature. I had already prepped Ethan's gym bag for the morning, confirmed his dental appointment via a shared calendar he rarely checked, and was currently plating a dinner that accounted for his recent complaints about high cholesterol. For 3 years, I hadn't just been his partner. I had been his infrastructure. I was the invisible hand that ensured his shirts were pressed. His bills were paid from our joint household account, mostly funded by my bonuses, and his life was devoid of the friction that usually humbles a man. Ethan walked into the kitchen smelling of expensive sandalwood and the arrogance of a man who has never been told no. He didn't look at me, not really. He looked through me the way one looks at a reliable appliance that has never failed to start. He was dressed in his favorite navy blazer, the one I had picked up from the dry cleaners only 4 hours earlier. He reached for his car keys on the granite island, his movements breezy and unburdened. There was no tension in his shoulders, no flicker of hesitation in his gait. He looked like a man going out for a casual drink with coworkers, except for the slight performative sigh. He let out the kind of sigh meant to signal that he was about to do something noble. Sarah called, he said, mentioning his ex-girlfriend with a familiarity that should have been buried years ago. She's had a devastating day, some drama at her firm, and she's spiraling. I told her I'd head over to her place to comfort her. She needs a stable friend right now. I stopped mid-motion, a serving spoon hovering over a bowl of roasted vegetables. I waited for the rest of the sentence, the part where he asked if I was okay with it, or the part where he explained why he was the only person on earth capable of providing this comfort at 8 o'clock on a Tuesday night. But those words never came. Instead, Ethan turned to face me, checking his reflection in the glass of the oven door, smoothing his hair with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. I might be late, so don't wait up, he added, his voice dropping into a tone of patronizing instruction. And please, Melissa, don't make a scene. She's already going through a lot. I don't have the energy to manage your jealousy on top of her crisis. The room didn't spin. My heart didn't shatter in a cinematic burst of glass. Instead, something much more terrifying happened. I went cold. It was the professional coldness I usually reserved for a vendor who had caught me in a blatant lie or an employee who had embezzled funds. The weight of his words wasn't just in the betrayal of his destination, but in the calculated insult of his delivery. He had categorized my heart, my dignity, and my 3 years of devotion as a scene to be managed. To him, my valid emotions were simply an operational inefficiency, a nuisance that interfered with his desire to play the hero for a woman he had never truly let go of. He stood there waiting for the predictable reaction. He expected the quiver in my lip, the frantic questions, the "how could you?" that would allow him to roll his eyes and label me dramatic. He wanted the fight because a fight is a form of engagement. It's a sign that the system is still struggling to survive. But as I looked at him, I didn't see the man I loved. I saw a failing asset. I saw a man who had mistaken my grace for weakness and my silence for a lack of sight. I realized that Ethan's entire life was a house of cards, and I was the only thing providing the windbreak. I felt a strange electric clarity wash over me. For years, I had been the fixer, the woman who smoothed over his rough edges and ignored the red flags because I believed in the project of us. But an operations manager knows when a project has reached a point of diminishing returns. His comment wasn't a slip of the tongue. It was a revelation of his character. He didn't see me as his equal or his future. He saw me as a utility, a comfortable home base to return to after he was done seeking excitement elsewhere. He truly believed that a simple command to not make a scene was enough to keep me in my place. I lowered the spoon back into the bowl, my hands perfectly steady. I looked him directly in the eyes, offering a small, vacant smile that mirrored the one he had given his reflection. I didn't ask about Sarah. I didn't ask how long he'd be gone. I didn't remind him that it was our anniversary next month, or that I had spent the last hour cooking his favorite meal. I simply let the silence stretch between us until it became a physical weight when he was too dull to feel. "I understand, Ethan," I said, my voice as smooth as silk. "Go. She clearly needs you more than I do tonight." He looked surprised for a fleeting second, perhaps disappointed that he didn't get the emotional outburst that would have justified his guilt. But his ego quickly smoothed it over. He nodded satisfied that he had managed me effectively. He grabbed his phone, tapped out a quick text note out to her, and walked toward the door without a second glance. I stood in the center of the kitchen, listening to the sound of his footsteps echoing down the hallway, the jingle of his keys, and finally the heavy thud of the front door closing. I heard his car engine start and the tires crunch over the gravel as he sped away toward another woman's crisis. I stayed in that spot for a long time, the silence of the house settling around me like a shroud. The dinner was getting cold on the counter, but I didn't care. The Melissa, he knew, the one who would have spent the night crying into a pillow or drafting a long, heartbreaking text message, was gone. In her place was someone far more dangerous. I walked over to the kitchen island and picked up my laptop, my fingers hovering over the keys with a newfound purpose. The audit had begun. I started by opening our shared banking portal and the administrative settings for our home security system. He wanted a night of comfort. I was going to give him a lifetime of consequences. I nodded like a woman who agreed, but inside, something older than love finally stood up. The sound of the front door clicking shut didn't just signal Ethan's departure. It served as the final bell for a performance I was no longer willing to stage. I sat at the kitchen island, the steam from the untouched dinner slowly dissipating into the cool air of the house. In my professional life, when a system begins to hemorrhage resources without any measurable output, we don't panic, we audit. I opened my laptop and felt my emotional pulse flatten into the steady, rhythmic hum of a machine. My fingers moved with cold precision, navigating through 3 years of digital records that told a story much darker than a simple case of a cheating fiancé. As I scrolled through our shared accounts and my own private ledgers, I began a mental asset versus liability analysis that stripped the romantic veneer off our relationship, leaving behind the skeletal truth of a parasitic transaction. I looked first at the deed to this house, the very walls that sheltered Ethan's ego. It was in my name, purchased with the sweat of my early 30s, and a down payment I had scrimmaged together while he was finding himself in a series of failed startups. I looked at the utility history and the mortgage payments. 90% of the funds had originated from my salary, while Ethan's contributions were erratic, labeled as investments in our future that never actually materialized. Even the wedding, we were supposedly planning the deposits for the vineyard, the catering the photographer had been billed to my credit cards. I realized with a jolting clarity that Ethan wasn't just a man who had lost his way. He was a sophisticated freeloader disguised as a partner in transition. He had used my stability as a launching pad for his whims, subsidized by my labor and protected by my silence. He had treated my bank account like a venture capital fund with no expectation of repayment, while I had treated his presence like a partnership that only existed in my own imagination. The audit inevitably expanded to include his family, and as I thought of them, the coldness in my chest turned to a hard, crystalline anger. I remembered the Thanksgiving dinners and the subtle, persistent way his mother Diane would pull me aside to praise my strength and maturity. At the time, I took it as a compliment, a warm welcome into their fold. Now, through the lens of this awakening, I saw it for exactly what it was: the grooming of a permanent caregiver. They didn't value me for my wit or my kindness. They valued me because I was the only person capable of keeping their son afloat. They had spent years pressuring me to be the stable one, a coded command to absorb Ethan's failures so they wouldn't have to deal with the fallout themselves. They had used my sense of duty as a license for his perpetual immaturity, expecting me to be the safety net that caught him every time he decided to jump without a parachute. I realized that to them, I wasn't a daughter-in-law to be cherished, but a high-functioning resource to be exploited until I was dry. The realization made me feel like an object, a line item in their family's survival strategy, and the disrespect of it was a bitter pill that I finally refused to swallow. But the most profound revelation came when I turned the audit inward. As I looked at a folder on my desktop labeled Wedding Ideas, I felt a strange sense of detachment, as if I were looking at the ruins of an ancient civilization I had never actually lived in. I searched for the grief I was supposed to feel, the devastating heartbreak of a woman whose fiancé was currently at his ex-girlfriend's apartment. It wasn't there. Instead, I found a startling, undeniable truth: I had stopped using the word "we" in my head months ago. While I was busy managing the logistics of our life, my subconscious had already been packing its bags. I hadn't been planning a wedding for the last 6 months. I had been performing a duty, a habitual maintenance of a structure I already knew was condemned. Tonight's insult wasn't the spark that lit the fire. It was simply the final glaring piece of evidence in a trial that had been going on in the back of my mind for a year. I wasn't a woman deciding to leave in a fit of pique. I was a woman realizing that the relationship had been a ghost for a very long time, and I had simply been the only one keeping the lights on. The bug in the system wasn't Ethan's trip to his ex's house. It was my own willingness to facilitate a life that didn't include my own happiness. I saw the patterns now: the way I would edit his work emails to make him sound more professional, the way I would pay the joint bills when he forgot his login, the way I would apologize to our friends for his absence. I had been his manager, his financier, and his publicist, but I had never truly been his partner, because a partner requires an equal. I closed the laptop, the screen's glow reflecting in the darkened window of the kitchen. I looked at the empty seat across from me and felt a massive tectonic shift in my soul. The illusion of our we had evaporated, leaving behind a very powerful I. I wasn't afraid of what would happen when he came back, because in every way that mattered, he had already been erased. I felt a surge of adrenaline, not from fear, but from the immense power of a woman who no longer has anything to lose because she has already let go. By the time he pulled into her driveway, I had already stopped thinking of him as my future. The stillness of the house was no longer a weight. It was a workspace. As the digital clock on the stove flickered, I transitioned from the internal audit of my soul to the external lockdown of my reality. In my line of work, when a security breach is identified, you don't sit around mourning the loss. You execute an immediate incident response protocol to prevent further contamination. I was no longer a woman whose fiancé was with another woman. I was an administrator revoking privileges from an unauthorized user. My movements were surgical and devoid of the frantic energy of a scorned lover. I started with the central nervous system of the house. Using my phone, I opened the administrative portal for our smart home network. With a few taps, I initiated a global password reset. I watched with a cold professional satisfaction as the list of connected devices shrank. I deauthorized his iPad, his laptop, and his gaming console, effectively severing his digital umbilical cord to my high-speed fiber line. Next, I moved to the smart lock settings. I deleted his Ethan home entry code and generated a new complex master key. I heard the faint metallic click of the deadbolt cycling through the house, a sound that felt more like a coronation than a breakup. I adjusted the Nest thermostat, resetting the schedules I had painstakingly programmed to keep him comfortable while he worked from my couch. The system was now mine again, recalibrated to my preferences, my safety, and my sole control. With the perimeter secured, I turned my attention to the financial supply lines that had kept Ethan's lifestyle afloat. I logged into my banking suite, navigating to the Authorized Users tab on my primary credit cards. It was a sobering sight to see how many of his daily conveniences, his Spotify Premium, his gym membership, his habitual Starbucks runs, were tethered to my credit score. One by one, I clicked Remove. There was no malice in the action, only a restoration of balance. I moved to our joint household account, which, as my earlier audit confirmed, was almost entirely funded by my quarterly bonuses. I didn't touch the meager few $100s he had deposited from a freelance gig last month. I wasn't a thief. I simply transferred my 85% of the balance into a private high-yield savings account that he didn't even know existed. I did the same with the wedding fund. As the numbers moved across the screen, I felt the invisible tether between us snap. I wasn't taking anything that belonged to him. I was simply choosing to stop being his benefactor. I was withdrawing the subsidy he had mistaken for an entitlement. In the world of operations, this is called decommissioning a failing asset, and I was doing it with a level of integrity that he would never be able to comprehend. As I worked, I realized something that should have shocked me, but instead felt like a deep, reassuring breath of air. I had built my life to be portable. This was the second major twist in the story of us, one that Ethan never saw coming because he was too busy enjoying the shade to look at the roots. Because of my professional training, I had always maintained a Plan B mentality, even when I thought I was in love. I had never fully merged my core assets. I had kept my premarital property and my primary retirement accounts strictly in my own name. I had always ensured that the lease on his car was in his name alone, even if I was the one reminding him to pay it. I hadn't consciously planned to kick him out, but my instincts as an operations manager had guided me to build a life where I could survive a total system failure without losing my foundation. I realized that for 3 years, I hadn't just been a partner, I had been a platform. I had provided the stability, the capital, and the organization that allowed him to pretend he was a successful, independent man. I wasn't destroying his life by changing these codes or moving this money. I was simply stopping the act of holding it up for him. I was removing the scaffolding, and if the building collapsed, it was only because he had failed to build a proper foundation of his own. The house felt different now, lighter, sharper, and entirely mine. The kitchen, once a place where I labored for his approval, was now just a room in a building I owned and controlled. I looked at my phone, seeing no messages from him, no "I'm sorry" or "I'm on my way back." He was still at her place, likely basking in the ego stroke of her crisis, entirely unaware that the world he took for granted had just been dismantled behind his back. He was a man who believed he held the power because he was the one who walked out the door, but he had forgotten who owned the door, the floor beneath it, and the lights above it. I stood up from the island, closed my laptop with a definitive snap, and walked toward the bedroom to get a good night's sleep. Tomorrow would bring the fallout, the phone calls from his family, and the inevitable confrontation when he realized his keys no longer worked. But as I turned off the final light via my app, I felt no trepidation. The system had been purged, the vulnerabilities patched, and the unauthorized user had been permanently disconnected. He still thought he had a home. I knew the system had already shut down. The morning sun filtered through the kitchen windows, illuminating a house that was finally under my total operational control. The silence was broken not by the sound of Ethan's key in the lock, since I had already received a notification that an unauthorized code had been attempted and rejected at 3:00 a.m., but by the frantic vibration of my phone. It was Diane, Ethan's mother. In the past, I would have answered on the first ring, eager to maintain the perfect daughter-in-law persona I had worked so hard to cultivate. Today, I let it ring until the very last second. When I finally answered, Diane's voice flooded the line, thick with that practiced, honeyed concern that had always been her primary tool for manipulation. She didn't lead with a question, she led with a lecture. She began weaving a classic American family-first narrative, speaking in lofty terms about the sanctity of commitment and the nobility of female forgiveness. She spoke about Ethan as if he were a wayward child who had simply stayed out past his curfew rather than a grown man who had abandoned his fiancée to comfort an ex-girlfriend. Then came the subtle generational jab that made my blood run cold. Diane lowered her voice, sounding conspiratorial and pitying as she reminded me that at 38 I wasn't exactly a blossoming girl anymore. She suggested that I was being far too picky for a woman of my age and that I should consider the optics of a broken engagement. She urged me to talk it out, implying that his betrayal was a mere misunderstanding that I, as the mature one, was obligated to fix for the sake of the family's appearance. It was a masterclass in gaslighting, a desperate attempt to shame me back into my role as the silent bearer of their son's burdens. I listened to her for a full minute, my expression as flat and unyielding as a marble countertop. I didn't interrupt her, nor did I offer a single sob or a word of defense. When she finally paused, waiting for me to break or apologize for my hastiness, I delivered the news with the clinical detachment of a bank manager notifying a client of a foreclosed loan. I told her simply that the relationship was terminated, that I had already changed the smart locks, and that Ethan's access to my financial resources had been permanently revoked. The transformation on the other end of the line was instantaneous and jarring. The honeyed concern for my marriage vanished, replaced by a sharp staccato burst of logistical panic. Diane didn't ask if I was hurt, or if I needed a friend, or how I was coping with the shock of the night before. Instead, her voice rose an octave as she began firing off a list of practical anxieties. She demanded to know where Ethan was supposed to sleep if he couldn't get into the house. She asked how he was expected to pay for his car insurance and his upcoming credit card bill now that I had removed him as an authorized user. She even had the audacity to ask if I had considered his stress levels during this transition. In that moment, the final veil was lifted. Diane wasn't worried about her son's soul or my broken heart. She was terrified that the golden ticket had just walked away. She was mourning the loss of a free property manager, a private banker, and a full-time emotional maid. Her panic confirmed my deepest suspicion they didn't love me for who I was. They loved me for the lifestyle I provided for their son, so they didn't have to provide it themselves. Throughout this verbal onslaught, I remained anchored in the power of my silence. I refused to engage in the drama Diane was trying to manufacture. I didn't argue about the ex-girlfriend, I didn't justify my anger, and I certainly didn't explain my age to a woman who viewed my maturity as a commodity. Every time she tried to bait me into a shouting match or a tearful explanation, I responded with a status update. I told her when Ethan's belongings would be packed and ready for curbside pickup. I informed her that the wedding vendors had already been notified of the cancellation. I spoke as if I were closing out a project that had failed to meet its year-end KPIs. By refusing to play the scorned woman, I denied Diane and her family the script they needed to make me the villain. They wanted a mess. I gave them a spreadsheet. They wanted a scene. I gave them a settlement. My lack of emotion was a shield they couldn't penetrate, and it left them flailing in a vacuum of their own making. It is a terrifying thing for a manipulator to realize they no longer have a handle to grab onto, and my utter composure was the most aggressive act of rebellion I could have staged. I wasn't begging for their approval or crying for their sympathy. I was simply checking out of a system that had failed to provide a return on my investment. As Diane's voice began to tremble with a mixture of rage and genuine fear, I realized that for the first time in 3 years, I held all the cards. She began to realize that I wasn't just mad, I was done. She saw that the structure she had relied on to keep her son stable was no longer operational, and the realization was visceral. She wasn't talking to Judith, the sweet fiancé, anymore. She was talking to Melissa, the woman who owned the house, the accounts, and the future they had all planned to spend. The shift in her tone went from demanding to pleading, and then finally to a cold, hollow realization. She stopped trying to guilt me and started trying to calculate her own losses. It was the most honest moment we had ever had, stripped of the pretense of familial love and reduced to the raw, ugly reality of dependency. I didn't need to yell to be heard. My silence had already told them everything they needed to know. The infrastructure had officially resigned, and the fallout was going to be theirs to manage. I hung up the phone without saying goodbye, placing it face down on the counter. The house was quiet again, but the world outside was beginning to shake. I could almost feel the ripples of panic traveling from Diane's house to wherever Ethan was hiding. That's when their concern stopped sounding like love and started sounding like fear. The silence following my conversation with Diane didn't last long. By late afternoon, the driveway sensors chimed and I watched through the security feed as Ethan's car pulled in with an aggressive jerk. He stepped out looking disheveled, the charming hero facade from the night before, replaced by the frantic energy of a man who had spent the last few hours being rejected twice. My sources, or rather a quick look at the GPS history on our shared vehicle app before I disconnected it, suggested his ex-girlfriend hadn't been the grieving soul he imagined. Once the novelty of stealing another woman's fiancé wore off, she had likely realized that an unemployed man with a blocked credit card was a burden she didn't care to comfort. Ethan strode toward the front door, his hand reaching for the handle with a proprietary confidence that was about to shatter. When the smart lock blinked a defiant red and remained motionless, he froze. He tried again, then began to pound on the wood, his face contorting in a way I had never seen. Without my management of his image, without the softening influence of the life I provided, he looked remarkably small. He wasn't the cool guy anymore. He was a desperate tenant facing an eviction he never saw coming. I walked to the front door but kept the heavy screen locked between us, looking at him with the clinical curiosity of a scientist observing a failed experiment. "Melissa, what the hell is this?" he hissed, his voice cracking. "My cards are declined, my phone is kicked off the network, and now I can't even get into my own house." I leaned against the doorframe, my posture relaxed, my pulse steady. "It was never your house, Ethan. It was my house that I allowed you to occupy, and it was never your money. It was my labor you were spending while you found yourself." He began a frantic monologue trying to explain that the night with his ex was a moment of weakness, a mistake born of his giving nature. He tried to play on my sympathies, talking about how he had nowhere to go and how his reputation would be ruined if people found out he was locked out. This was the moment I had been waiting for, the moment to reveal the final layer of the infrastructure he had taken for granted. I told him quite calmly that his reputation was already a hollow shell. I revealed that for 2 years I had been the one quietly redrafting his brilliant work emails before he sent them, catching the embarrassing typos and professional lapses that would have gotten him fired months ago. I reminded him of the lucky breaks he had with clients, breaks that only happened because I had curated his social calendar and whispered the right names into the right ears at charity events he was too bored to pay attention to. I told him he hadn't succeeded in this city because he was talented. He had succeeded because he was Melissa managed. Without me to ghostwrite his life, he was a man who couldn't even manage a basic calendar or a grocery list. I watched the realization sink in the horror of a man realizing that his entire identity was a curated project maintained by a woman he had just called a nuisance. The ghost manager was officially on strike, and the business of Ethan was going bankrupt in real time. He looked at me, then his eyes filling with a performative moisture, and he tried the last tool in his kit, the love card. He spoke about our history, our shared dreams, and how we were supposed to grow old in this house together. He begged me not to throw away 3 years over one night. But as I looked at him through the mesh of the screen, I didn't feel the pull of those memories. I felt a profound sense of completion. He wasn't a partner I was losing. He was a project I had finally finished. I had seen the final data points, I had analyzed the results, and the conclusion was undeniable. He was a liability that could no longer be sustained. The love he was talking about was just another resource he wanted to exploit, a way to get back to the comfort and the credit cards. I felt an immense, soaring relief, the kind one feels when they finally submit a massive, soul-crushing report for a job they never wanted in the first place. I realized that the scene he was so afraid of wasn't a shouting match, it was this, the cold, quiet withdrawal of my existence from his. He continued to plead, his voice rising as he realized I wasn't opening the door. He asked about his clothes, his shoes, his life. I told him his life was currently sitting in 3 neatly taped boxes on the curb around the corner, and that his car, the one I had been paying for, was being picked up by the leasing company tomorrow morning since I had terminated the payment plan. He looked at me with a hollow, wide-eyed terror, the reality of his own incompetence finally catching up to him. He was a 35-year-old man who didn't know how to survive without a woman to hold the umbrella over his head, and it was finally raining. He asked where he was supposed to go, his voice small and genuinely lost for the first time in his life. I didn't feel a flicker of guilt. I simply looked at my watch, noted that I had a conference call in 10 minutes, and stepped back into the foyer. I didn't need to give him an answer because he wasn't my responsibility anymore. I closed the door before answering. The sound of the deadbolt sliding into place was the last note in the symphony of my old life, and the silence that followed was the most beautiful thing I had ever heard. 6 months have passed since that evening, and my life has become a masterpiece of curated peace. I wake up in a house that smells of fresh cedar and expensive coffee, not the lingering scent of someone else's clutter or the heavy air of unacknowledged resentment. My home is finally my own, a sanctuary where every object and every hour belongs entirely to me. Without the constant operational drain of managing a man who refused to grow up, my finances have done more than just recover, they have soared. I took the money I had set aside for a wedding that would have been a life sentence and invested it in a small consultancy firm I'd been dreaming of for years. The return on investment has been staggering, not just in dollars, but in the sheer, unadulterated joy of running a system that finally works without errors. I often sit on my back porch in the evenings watching the sunset with a glass of wine and marvel at how the tragedy of that Tuesday night was actually the greatest promotion of my life. I wasn't fired from a relationship. I was liberated from a role I was overqualified for. From what I hear through the grapevine, not because I ask, but because a woman like Diane can never truly stay silent, Ethan's new reality is a stark gray contrast to the world I built for him. He is living in a cramped one-bedroom apartment on the far side of the city, struggling with the basic adult responsibilities that I used to handle before he even woke up. Without my ghost management, his professional life has hit a wall. He discovered far too late that comforting ex-girlfriends is easy when someone else is paying your car note and editing your emails, but it's nearly impossible when you're worried about whether your electricity will be shut off. There was no need for a dramatic cinematic revenge. I didn't have to ruin him. I simply had to stop helping him. His downward spiral is the natural consequence of a man who relied on the respect of a woman he never bothered to earn. He is finally facing the world without a filter, and he is finding that the world isn't nearly as kind as the woman he took for granted. His struggle isn't my malice, it is simply the truth of his own incompetence finally allowed to exist in the light. To the women who have spent decades being the infrastructure for people who don't deserve the support, I want to say, this, the greatest act of self-love, isn't a scene or a shouting match. It isn't a public exposure or a desperate attempt to make him see your value. The ultimate power lies in the quiet, absolute withdrawal of your energy. We are taught that being alone is a failure, a status to be feared as we get older. But I have learned that being alone is merely a state of being, while being at peace is a hard-won choice. There is a profound dignity in walking away without an explanation to those who never bothered to listen when you were speaking. You do not owe your life's work to a man who treats your devotion like a utility. When you stop holding up the world for someone else, you finally have your hands free to build something for yourself. My life is no longer a project to be managed. It is a journey to be enjoyed, and I have found that the view is much better when you're not carrying someone else's luggage. I remember his final words to me as he stood on the other side of that locked door shouting that I was cold, that I was heartless, and that I would regret throwing away everything over a single night. He truly believed that I was the one losing out, that I was the one who would wake up in the middle of the night reaching for a ghost. But as I look at my reflection today, stronger, wealthier, and infinitely lighter, I realize that everything was never him. Everything was the potential I had been pouring into a cracked vessel. Now, that potential is all mine. I have reclaimed my time, my assets, and my future, and the silence of my home is a constant reminder of the bullet I didn't just dodge, but redirected. He said I would regret it. 6 months later, peace proved him wrong. Thank you for following Melissa's journey of transformation and reclaiming her power. This story serves as a powerful reminder that our worth is not measured by how much we can endure for those who refuse to value us, but by the courage we have to choose our own peace. If you found strength in Melissa's quiet revolution and want to see more stories of resilience, justice, and the ultimate triumph of self-respect, please subscribe to our channel and join our growing community of empowered women. We want to hear from you in the comments below. Do you think Melissa was too cold in her approach, or was her systematic erasure the only logical response to a lifetime of being taken for granted? Many of our viewers have shared that the moment of realizing you are a partner's manager rather than their equal is the most painful awakening of all. What was your favorite part of this audit? Your insights and stories help us grow and provide a space where dignity always gets the final word. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss a new episode of Standing Up for What You Deserve. Your support means everything as we continue to share these narratives of strength. Peace is a choice, and today we choose it together.